Okay. We are going to mute everyone. You can use chat icon to send out your question, or maybe at the end of talk, you can come back and ask your question. I'm pleased and honored to introduce our guest speaker to today's Colloquium. Professor Matt Wan is a distinguished professor of statistics at the University of Technology, Sydney. He has made an invaluable contribution to different fields of statistics, including statistical computing, generalized linear mixed model, and semi-parametric regression. At the moment, Matt serves as an associate editor for the Statistics Journal, Australian and New Zealand Journal of Statistics. Today, Matt will talk about Streamlined variational inference for random effect models. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Wan.
All right, thanks very much, Hassan. And what better way to spend a rainy Friday afternoon here in Sydney talking about random effects models, but I'll try not to make it too painful for you before we have like beer o'clock and other things later in the evening. All right, so I've divided the talk into three parts: motivation. The middle part, I'll talk a bit about variational inference, which I've talked about many times before in the last several years. So some of you might have seen these slides before. And then part three is quite new in terms of talks on random effects streamlining. All right, so let's start with motivation. And I'm going to do it through some real data examples. This one is a data set that involves 45,000 infants from a public health study that took place in the United States 1 or 2 decades ago. And I'm going to use the word nested because that's important for what's coming up later. So we have clinic visits nested within infant. So that means that each infant had multiple clinic visits. So here's one subset of the data where we have a measurement of the infant's height or length, which is called height for age Z-score. And comparing
Excuse me, Matt.
Yeah.
I just see the title slide at the moment.
All right. So the slides haven't progressed. All right. So that's interesting. All right. So
perhaps everybody could mute their video. That's the problem. It's a bandwidth issue.
Bandwidth issue, is it? All right. So have we gone from the title slide now?
Yeah, we are in the second, I think. Yeah, the second slide.
So the change that I did was I went from full screen mode on my computer to away from full screen mode. So I don't know whether that's an explanation. All right, so I got up, before you told me about the problem, I got up to this slide that has several scatter plots. Is that projecting all right?
Yeah, everything's okay, all good.
Yeah, all right. All right, so this is where I got up to. So I think I'll avoid going to full screen mode on my computer now. All right, so what we have here is a measure of the infant's size, which is called height for age Z-score, versus their age in days. And in this case, we're actually fitting quadratics to each infant because there's a little bit of nonlinearity present in the scatter plots like this one here. So there's quite a few of these panels, these plots, because there's 45,000 infants. I'm not going to show you all 45,000. So the previous, I've just shown you 10 slides that had 960 panels, and that corresponds to only 2% of the infants in the study, or 2% of the random quadratic fits that are used in a random effects model to account for the effect of the size of the infant on, sorry, to account for the effect of the age of the infant on its size. But at the end of the day, we're really just doing regression analysis. So here's a plot that summarizes the regression analysis for various predictors that impact the size of the infant, such as an indicator of whether the infant's male, Asian, whether the mother's Asian, whether the mother's black. This one here is one that's of interest in a medical study. This is the indicator of whether the mother smoked 10 or more cigarettes per day. And these are 95% credible intervals for each of these, the effects of each of these predictors. So we are doing regression analysis, but the important thing here is that we had to account for strong heterogeneity in the height for age, Z-score versus age effects. And to do that, we had to fit 45,000 quadratics. So this is really the sort of things that have to be done when you have longitudinal studies, big longitudinal studies, and you have to account for things like what's on the screen using random effects. Now, if you fit the model using Markov chain Monte Carlo via the package in R known as RStan, it took me 36 hours. If we use streamlined variational inference, which is the topic of today's talk, it took 24 seconds. So you can see that there are big gains, at least compared to Stan, by using our newly developed methodology known as streamlined variational inference. In the last few months since I first gave this talk in Newcastle, the referees have asked us to program it different ways, and we have got the Markov chain Monte Carlo running much faster, down to hours rather than 36 hours. But at least if you say, I don't want to program it myself and just get Stan to do it, then it's 36 hours. All right, so the next example is one where we have higher levels of nesting. So instead of just having, as with the previous example, clinical visits nested within infants, here we have, these are rodents from a cancer study where we have slices of tumors. So each panel corresponds to a slice within a tumor for several rodents. So this is, yeah, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on 3 levels given the amount of time available, but I just wanted to point out quickly that the methodology for this talk and the corresponding papers is able to handle the extra level of nesting that's happening in these data. So the talk that I gave, the talk that I wrote for the Newcastle conference back in December was such that it was a general audience, not necessarily in statistics. So some of these slides may be repeating stuff that the statistics audience know really well, but I'll go through it anyway, just to be sure. So So apologies if you're really into random effects models and longitudinal and other areas of group data and know this stuff really well. So two-level nesting would be something like if we group Sydney residents according to suburb. Whereas three-level nested groupings would be taking Sydney residents and then grouping them with according to suburb, and then also keeping track of the municipal council area. And as we know, each suburb is nested within a municipal council. You don't have any suburb that's within two municipal councils. So we have that nesting aspect for this example. Cross-grouping is where you might have Sydney residents cross-tabulated according to, say, suburb and ethnicity. So now we don't have any notion of nesting anymore. And we could imagine, choosing a random suburb of Sydney and having both, keeping track of both, not taking a random subset, but keeping track of both the suburb and the ethnicity when we cross-tabulate residents of Sydney. So now that we've started talking about cross-random effects, and these come up a lot in areas such as psychology and psychometrics and psycholinguistics. So this is a data set that has test scores for around 8,500 students crossed with 24 test items. All right, so here we're going to go through a subset of the data. So each panel corresponds to test score versus the year that the student's in. And I'm going to do about 10 of these plots. So there was 10 slides that I just went through. So we had another 960 panels. What we just went through in the last 10 slides was only about 0.5% of all random line fits. So yeah, so there's a lot of lines that have to get fit. But again, we are just doing regression type analyses. So here are some of the things of interest for this particular data set and the underlying study. So for example, the indicator that mother has at least high school education has a significant positive effect on mean score. So it's important to note that the previous slide isn't just ordinary linear regression. We needed to account for the strong heterogeneity in score versus year, which involved fitting 200,000 lines using the random effects paradigm. And then when we try to fit this using Stan, we let it run for 3 days, but it didn't give us answers, it crashed. When we do it using our streamlined variational inference, we get answers in 5 minutes. So this is an example that's challenging if you say, I want to do it in Stan. I haven't got around to trying to program it myself. That would, of course, take quite a bit of time, maybe several hours, to program it, say, in C++. But if you say, I haven't got time, or I'm not good enough to program it and I need to use Stan, then it's not really viable on current day computers. All right, so random effect models are a very big topic in statistics. I would say huge. And it took me a while to work out how huge the area is, because I started working in this when I was in a school of public health in America. And over the years, I've realized that there's lots of other areas outside of public health and medicine that use random effects models. So here are some of the main ones. There might even be others that I haven't figured out yet, but and they all have different names as well. So what public health people call mixed models, the education, social science people tend to call multi-level models. Then in surveys, it's small area estimation. The econometricians talk about panel data. And in psychometrics, they have phrases like item response theory and rash models for what is pretty much just the same mathematical construct that I usually call in my papers mixed models. And so that these are wheat silos or grain silos that are meant to show that often there's not a lot of interaction that goes on between the different areas. So you have all the econometricians and so on publishing their papers with their terminology, without a lot of interplay between the other areas. All right, so this talks on variational inference, which until say around 10 years ago had most of its literature within computer science and machine learning, and little or none of that literature contains random effects models. All right, so I think I'm correct in saying that, yeah, typical models or constructs or whatever that are used in, could be robot vision or something that comes up in machine learning and computer science, don't have this nuance that statisticians are used to, I guess, or econometricians and other branches known as random effects models. So during the last 5 years, various members of my group, postdocs and doctoral students, I guess it's mainly doctoral students, have been developing a systematic approach to storage and operation efficient variational inference for models containing random effects. It has been quite challenging, painstaking, and time consuming. I shudder when I think of the dozens of hours that we've spent on this in the last 5 years or so. In the last year, we've now managed to put the papers out. There's 4 of them with about 170 pages in total, if you count all of the supplements. And in the last year, they've all been put on the archive preprint network and on my website. And this is a typo from this morning, because when I was going through the slides, I can now happily report that 2 of them are now published or almost published. And this is almost the first time I've spoken about it. I did give it once before in December. So this is quite new in terms of, the work's been going for 5 years, but this is quite new in terms of like putting it all together and trying to cover it in a 1 hour talk. So this is the second time I've presented it. All right, so that's the end of part 1 out of 3 at 3:22 in the afternoon. I don't know how feasible it is to do questions in this Zoom format. So I think it might be better if I just move on and leave the questions towards the end. But if anyone's desperate to ask a question, I'll just pause for a second and have a drink of water before we move on to part 2. All right, so part 2 on variational inference. And some of you have seen these slides before, but hopefully they're new to many of you. All right, so this is I guess a notorious statistics problem that I've spent a lot of time on as well over the years in various forms. But the simplest form is where you just have a scatter plot that has a nonlinear signal, and you want to fit a curve to it. So think of the mean of the y variable given x as being a smooth function f of x, and we want to estimate f from the scatter plot. So there's dozens, maybe even hundreds of ways to do it that have been published over the years or over the decades. One way to do it is to become a Bayesian and use a Bayesian mixed model formulation where the Z matrix contains spline basis functions. The X matrix is just the straight line basis functions. And then you put a random effects structure on the coefficients of the splines, and then you essentially turn the Bayesian handle, throw it into your favorite MC and Markov chain Monte Carlo package, such as Stan or Bugs, and it works quite well, although it can be a bit slow. So, so what I just had on the previous slide is the mathematical formula way of saying the model, but perhaps a nicer way, particularly late on a Friday afternoon, is to do it using graphs. So this is a directed acyclic graph representation of the model where the arrows correspond to sort of like the parent-child relationship, like U depends on sigma squared U. So we show that through this sort of family tree type arrow relationship. And the Y is shaded because that's the observed data. And we want to make inference about all the other nodes given the nodes being circles, given the observed data in Y. All right, so variational Bayes or variational inference is based on some simplifying assumptions. And this slide tries to explain it in one graphic. You start off with the directed acyclic graph of the model, and then you form what's called the moral graph. And the moral graph is one that says that if you've got a family tree where two nodes have given birth to a baby node, but they aren't married, that's immoral. So you need to marry them and join the edges of nodes that have given birth to a baby without being married. So this is the moral graph corresponding to the one on the left. And this shows sort of the full structure of all the independencies going on if we go off and do a full Bayesian analysis, right? Fully accurate, proper Bayesian analysis. That turns out to be quite hard and slow for really huge models. So a way out to make things really fly, if you like, get it down from 36 hours to 24 seconds, for really big models, is to kick out some of the edges and hope that you can get away with it. And that's known as the mean field approximation. So most of our papers use the letter P for the density functions when you do exact inference. But then if you start kicking out some of the edges, you're doing an approximation that you hope's not too bad. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then the letter Q gets used to distinguish from the exact one P. And we're going to call this the Q world. And that corresponds to this idea of doing mean field approximate inference. So we go from the P world with all the edges to the Q world with some of the edges kicked out. Algebraically, what we're doing is taking the joint posterior density function of all the random variables in the model and breaking it up into a product of various factors and simplifying the Bayesian inference by working with this product restriction. It turns out for this this example I'm giving now, you can get it down to just one split, if you like, where you just have one Q density for the betas and the U's and the A's, and the other ones for the sigma squareds. And then you just choose the Q density to make them as close as possible to the P densities. And you have a convex coordinate ascent algorithm with simple algebraic forms. So after going through all that and doing a bit more algebra, you end up with an algorithm that doesn't involve Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling, which is quite expensive for huge models. It just involves matrix algebraic calculations, and this tends to converge quite rapidly, and so you get answers, you know, very quickly. So, all right, so that's just a brief sort of tutorial on variational inference, or the type of variational inference we're using in these papers. So now, when we go back to random effects models, it turns out that in the nested case, like even when we have 3-level nested random effects models, the only product restriction that we need is the one given here that says that we separate the effects, if you like, the beta and the U, from the variance and covariance parameters, and otherwise we keep everything together. And that's important because if you start splitting these up, then that's where you start to get a lot of inaccuracy. But if you're able to keep these apart, then you don't lose much accuracy at all. And underpinning this, I guess there are sort of parameter orthogonality results from likelihood theory that say that, you know, the betas and the U's don't really get impacted by what happens for the variance parameters. Now, when we go to the cross-random effects situation, which is harder, we decided that we had to look at 3 levels of stringency. And so if we just start from the bottom, the least stringent is that you keep the beta and the U's and U dashes. So U's might be like, in that example, that might be for the students in the study, and the U dash would be the items, right? So these happen a lot in psychological type studies. But depending on the size of the study, you may have to separate the U's from the U dashes. So you have this trade-off where you have to decide, and this really depends on how big the study is or how big the data are, between imposing stringent restrictions that getting really quick, low storage answers, or having low stringency and more accuracy, but having higher storage and bigger computational costs. Yeah. So in terms of graphs, the least stringent one says you don't kick out any edges at all between the beta and the U and the U dash. But the other ones say that you start removing edges, right? But you always, we can always keep the U and U dashes edges in there, so that we can at least do that. But if we want to get things faster, we need to start thinking about separating or kicking out some of these edges. And this is what happens depending on how many edges you kick out. So the orange one is sort of like the benchmark if you use Markov chain Monte Carlo for the posterior density function of 2 of the beta parameters. And if you use the least stringent one, which is the darkest blue, you can see that the orange and the darkest blue are very close to each other. So that says you're getting really quite good accuracy using variational inference. But as you start to make things less stringent, then you start to lose accuracy. And this middle blue one, that one says that you underestimate the variance. You still do well in terms of the mean, but you're not really doing, you know, brilliant inference in terms of getting the posterior variance correct. And then if you do the fastest one, then you end up with this light blue one that's even worse. So this is really the way life is. You have to, you know, life's full of trade-offs, and this is the trade-offs when variational inference meets cross-random effects models. And then, yeah, this is what happens for several parameters. And you can see along the axis, I've got Roman numbers 1, 2, and 3. And you can see that the accuracy for, let's say, you know, this random effect called U-31, it's close to 100% accuracy for number 3, but then it goes down for restriction Roman numbers 2 and restriction Roman number 1. All right, so then for a 3-level example corresponding to that tumor type rodent study, we are able to get very good accuracy. So it's probably a little bit hard to see well on this slide because there's so many density functions, but we've got orange and blue curves corresponding to Markov chain, Monte Carlo, and variational inference. And in this case, and I have to admit it's because the response is Gaussian. If it was non-Gaussian, things are not as nice. But in this Gaussian example, you do tend to get very good accuracy. All right, so I'm now getting close to the end of part 2 out of part 3. I just wanted to briefly mention an alternative way of doing variational inference known as the message passing alternative. And so this facilitates the building of arbitrarily large models from a relatively small set of algebraic primitives. So we published our first paper in this 3 years ago in JASA. And since then, my group and I have published another 3 papers on it. So this is, I just wanted to say that, well, I guess there's a few ways you can do variational inference, but this has the attraction of allowing you to sort of build up your code and primitives. And the at least one of the 4 papers from today's talk does this for streamlined variational inference for random effects models. I think I'll skip that one. Yeah, all right. So, yeah, so message passing is local on a factor graph, and the idea of this figure is that you only have to like pass message. I mean, the messages that get passed, say, on this part of the factor graph. I don't know if this pointer works though on Zoom. So anyway, so this may or may not be working. But anyway, if a message passes down in the bottom part of the factor graph, it doesn't really matter what's happening up in a different part of the factor graph. So you can really like parallelize the coding and have the inference done in a very efficient way using message passing. And then in the 2017 paper, we developed these things known as fragments that you can think of as building blocks to very large regression type models. And so this is the idea of like putting together fragments and sort of building up to larger and larger models. And for growth curves, so these are like a fancier version of a random effects model. You can actually just do them. You can do the variational inference just by taking, I think there's just 4 separate fragments and figuring out the messages for those and just sticking them together. So the previous slide only used members of, they only used the bottom 4 out of these fragments. So in one of the 4 papers for today's talk, which we think is just about to get accepted in Journal of Machine Learning Research, we've done a couple of big revisions for it. We also provide new factor graph fragments, which allow streamlining of variational message passing with both 2-level and 3-level nesting. So this is one reason why this paper took ages and ages to write, because figuring all this stuff out with the fragments was a lot of algebra. But the good news is that we've done it, and now for the rest of humanity, people can just use these fragments to build up their streamlined variational models with 2 levels and 3 levels of nesting. All right, so 3:39 sounds like a good time to be at the end of part 2 out of 3 for a 1-hour talk. So now the final part is on random effects streamlining. So the essence of the problem, and so this is really nothing to do with statistics at the moment. So there's a sense in which you can forget about statistics and just be a pure mathematician and just think in terms of linear algebra and the like. And we have to solve this system of equations, B transpose B inverse times B transpose little b. That's a fairly standard one. Everybody who's worked in statistics knows about this, corresponding to least squares fitting. The one that's not as common, and it's a little bit of a mouthful, we also need to get subblocks of B transpose B inverse. We don't need the whole matrix. We only need it in positions matching the non-zero subblocks of B transpose B. All right, so that might be hard to like keep in your head late on a Friday afternoon, but see how you go. And I'll try to explain it in a few slides from now with some graphics. And B has high level sparse structure. So let's start first with a nested case. And B matrices with 2-level sparse structure look like this, where the yellow are positions of the matrix that are 0 and the shades of blue are non-zero. But in practice, you tend to have things much sparser, where each of these blocks would correspond to the number of subjects or groups in the study. So the first example had 45,000 infants. So you would have 45,000 of these little blocks coming down the diagonal and lots of yellow. Lots of yellow because most of the matrices are 0. And then the B transpose B matrices look like this. And these positions where you have blue, think about inverting the matrix, but we only care about B transpose B inverse in the blue sections. So B transpose B is sparse. B transpose B inverse is not sparse, but that's all right because we only care about the blue positions. And then here's a bigger one. If we now go to 3-level sparse structure, it's like we're replicating the 2-level structure down the diagonal. So you tend to have this pattern. So this is the B matrix. And you can see it starts to get sparser and sparser for more realistic numbers of groups for real studies. And then when we look at B transpose B, the positions of the non-zero blocks of B transpose B are these regions. So you can see that we've got like the 2-level structure coming down the diagonal. And so the mathematical problem that's nothing to do with statistics as such, but it's motivated by statistics, is saying, I want to invert this matrix, but like a much huger version of it, with say, 45,000 blocks coming down here. But I don't want the full inverse, I only want the inverse, the entries of the inverse at these blue positions. And as of about 3 days ago, it's published in the Anzium journal. So, so this is with my recently graduated PhD student, Tui Nolan. And this is a very rare example of a Mat 1 paper that has no graphics and in a maths journal, as opposed to a stats journal. So my first ever paper in Anzium journal. But we provide fully efficient solutions to the 2-level and 3-level cases. So after figuring all that out, which took a long time, we can now summarize the procedures in these algorithms that involve like QR decompositions and the like. And we can tuck them away, in a boxed algorithm in the papers, or in functions that you might write in your favorite language, whether it's Python or MATLAB or R or C++. And so this is like the 2-level solve sparse least squares algorithm. And then there's the 3-level solve sparse least squares algorithm. And this comes up in, these algorithms come up in all the papers. So they're not just useful for the simplest models, they come up for the more complicated models involving group-specific curves and the like. All right, so starting to wrap up now. Let's look at some timing comparisons. And what we've got here is the 2-level case for some linear mixed models. And little m is the number of groups that goes between, say, 200 and 1,000. And then this is the number of seconds. So if you just do things naively, it takes 427 seconds, which is 7 minutes, about 7 minutes, I think. Whereas with Streamlined, it takes about 1/5 of a second. And you can say the speed up's about 2,300. And then if you go to even bigger numbers of groups, like 400, 1,200, 10,800, 32,400, Streamlined becomes infeasible, but we're getting down to about 7 seconds using Streamlined variational inference. So there's really no limit, if you like, to the size of the problem when you do things in this streamlined algebraic way and using variational inference. All right, so now we're going to go to the crossed case, which is more challenging, but this is important because in a lot of studies, the group sizes are such that one tends to be bigger than the other. So we're going to label the number of groups M and M dash, but we're going to choose the labeling so that M is the bigger one. And if you have like a study with people and items, often M is the number of people. So you might have, a study with 8,000 school students, but the number of items or the number of questions in a questionnaire might only be, 50 or something. So this does tend to happen where M is much bigger than M dash, and that's important for doing streamlining. If M and M dash are 2, then you don't have much of a advantage. But when M is 5 and M dash is 2, you start to get sparseness coming in. And now yellow is 0. blue is non-zero, and orange is also 0. But it's like you don't really get an advantage from the orange sparseness areas if you use the algorithms from earlier slides. But you can take advantage of the yellow sparseness still. So it's kind of like you're stuck with the orange ones, that they're zeros. So if you have a psychometric study with 20 subjects and 5 items, you actually do have this sort of 2-level sparse structure that you can take advantage of by using the yellow sparseness. And this is m equals 50 and m dash equals 10. Whereas if you had m equals 50 and m dash equals 40, you're kind of stuck with this big orange region, so things will start to slow down in that case. So this table, so this shows some of the timing comparisons, and so we end up with, like, for stringency 2, we end up with, it being thousands of times faster than Markov chain Monte Carlo, at least using Stan. Whereas here you can see that the most accurate one might be about a couple of 100 times slower compared to the less accurate stringency 2 one. So you really have to decide, depending on your M and M dash, how long you want the computer to run for. All right, so 350, and we can now wrap up. And first of all, I need to mention that I've got this work involves 4 co-authors, and 2 of them are doing postdocs in Ivy League universities. So that's former postdocs and students, Marianne Menictus, who's at Harvard, and Tui Nolan, who's on a Fulbright scholarship at Cornell. And Doug Simpson's an old friend of mine at University of Illinois who was part of one of these 4 papers. All right, so all the papers are on the web. So the first one, the mathematical one, just came out in Anzian Journal. The third one is about to come out in the journal Statistical Modeling, and the other ones are still waiting for final decisions. But all 4 of the papers are on the archive preprint server and my website. All right, so that's the last slide. So I'm happy to take.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. Thank you very much. I think everyone can unmute themselves. If you have a question, maybe you can ask your question now.
Yeah, thank you. I just have a quick question. So in the split of the graph, so when we split the graph, so is there any adaptive way to balance the accuracy and the speed?
So when you split the graph, yeah, so this is what tables like this are all about. So it's really, I guess we're just telling our readership, the pros and cons of that strategy. So you need to decide if you're a psychometrician and have a study with 200 subjects and 40 items, are you willing to wait 66 seconds, 67 seconds to get an answer, compared to 1.5 seconds to get an answer? So there's no absolute answer to these questions. So I hope I'm addressing your question as well. I mean, it really is just up to the user to decide, based on simulation studies like this, to figure out which way they want to go and how much inaccuracy they're willing to live with. Did I I hope I addressed that question well, but I'm not so sure. It's a bit hard over Zoom, of course. I can't look into your eyes and see whether you're nodding or shaking your head or whatever.
Thanks. Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, any other question?
Hi, Matt. This is Jun here.
Yeah,
I
June.
would like to ask one question. Have you tried your method for, because when I look at your example, it's mainly Gaussian normal distribution with, you know, a normal distribution penalty or something like that. Have you tried your method with other distributions? For example, if you want to fit a mixed model with Poisson response or the penalty is L1 norm, something like that.
Yes. Yep. One of my students, who was a practicum student from Italy, I think has thesis chapters with one of the things you just said, which is Poisson. But we haven't got around to like submitting journal articles. I'm just thinking, have we done? Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier in this talk, it's taken us like 5 years just to get around to organizing all the algebra in the papers for the Gaussian response case. So it's, I think, at least for my group, it's just in, oh, hang on, sorry. Yeah, there is one paper that I published with one of my former students, Kathy Lee, in 2016 that might have had some binary response stuff in it. So Lee and Wand is one answer to your question. And for L1, no, we haven't done L1 yet, but we may be starting on that just based on recent research in the last few months.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think Lee and Wand is probably there's actually 2 Lee and Wand papers that are on my website that may help with answering your question.
Okay.
Hi, can I?
Yeah, sure. Can I ask?
Thanks, Matt, for your great talk. Just a question, because you use Gaussian distribution, what about your point of view with a Vecchia approximation? Can deals with your program?
What about the point of view with what approximation?
Vecchia, the Vecchia approximation?
Can you spell that out? Because I'm having trouble working out what.
Vecchia, V-E-C-C-H-I-A.
V-E-C-C-H-I-A. Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Is like the stain approximation. What you, instead to have your joint distribution, you approximate your joint distribution by conditional distribution, but with the closest neighbor.
All right. I can't really comment because I'm hearing about this for the first time now.
Oh, okay. Is used a lot in a spatial field.
All right. Okay. Yeah, I've made a note of it. I'll look it up, but I've never heard of it until you just said it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for the talk. A question. So I'm interested in problems where you have this longitudinal model, and then you have another level of another model where you use the profiles that you find in the longitudinal models. And if you try to model everything jointly, it's quite complicated problem. Am I correct in thinking that applying variational inference in this situation would involve thinking about the problem as separate models, like basically deleting the connection between the model that uses the profiles and the model that models the profiles?
I mean, I'm struggling a little bit with your question. It seems like you're talking about modeling issues, whereas my talk is saying, all right, everyone's agreed what the model is, and now we just need to compute the thing.
Right. No. I'm talking about computing estimation. So think about a joint mixed model with a survival model,
Yes.
and you have this complicated model to estimate parameters that are connected between the two models.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you can, one way of approaching this would be to consider the two models separately. So basically, in terms of posterior, you'd consider that parameters in one model were independent from the other model.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I haven't thought about that for, say, longitudinal survival models. So, yeah, I don't think I can add too much more.
Okay.
I mean,
cheers.
Based on my limited knowledge of the sort of models that you're talking about.
Okay, any other question?
Yeah, so I just wonder, so if we want to remove the asymptotic accuracy, so that is if we want the accuracy to be 0 when the sample size goes to infinity, so could we achieve that by adjusting some of the tuning parameter?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good question. Like doing some theory, asymptotic theory for variational inference, and there is some starting to appear, I've noticed, and like there's even a paper in JASA from the Bly group in Columbia University in New York. It's come out in the last year. The talk that I've just given this afternoon, everything is Gaussian. I mean, sorry, the response is Gaussian. And so in that case, you do get, if you stop being a Bayesian for a minute, become a likelihood person, then you do have this orthogonality between the regression parameters and the variance parameters. So I'd like to think that there's some underlying theory that says if the priors are diffuse enough, then you would get asymptotically improving accuracy. But I still haven't seen any papers that have done that yet. They may be there, but I haven't noticed that. But yeah, I think there is a possibility for theory along those lines.
Okay. Any question? Maybe last question? Oh, okay, maybe I can ask the last question. Can we use the procedure for additive model?
Yes. So again, those papers that I mentioned with my former student, Kathy Lee, that came out in the year 2016, I think we do have some additive model structures in those papers. So these are 2 papers on my website or also in the journals that are related to what I've spoken about today. So yes, the quick answer is yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
On a Friday. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Please join me to thank Matt for his wonderful talk. Okay, we can stop here, and I wish you have a great, wonderful weekend. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Hassan. Thanks, everyone.